Funding for this program was provided by Friends, the Iowa Public Television Foundation. Generations of families and friends who feel passionate about the programs they watch on Iowa Public Television.
As someone who has studied Middle Archaic sites in other parts of the Midwest, it's important to impress that not just for Iowa, but for regionally, the deposits preserved at the Palace site are spectacular in terms of the knowledge we have of what was going on 7,000 years ago. So it truly is a special place.
By uncovering a 7,000-year-old settlement, finding Iowa's oldest human remains, and also the state's best preserved village, Iowa scientists are learning new details about prehistoric Midwest living. On Tuesday, March 6, 2012, the Science Center of Iowa invited presenters from the University of Iowa's Office of the State Archaeologist to speak to the general public at Java Joe's Coffee House in downtown Des Moines. This presentation is part of the Café Scientifique series, which is sponsored by Pioneer Hybrid. Now, here are the state archaeologists to share their findings and teach us about uncovering history under our streets and along our riverbanks on this Café Scientifique.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for having us here, and thanks for participating, and thanks, Sarah and the Science Center for hosting. This is an unusual event for us. Often we go out individually and give talks to usually smaller groups, so this is great to see both a very large group of interested people and to have so many of my colleagues here too. So I'm only going to take a couple minutes and provide a little bit of background on why archaeology gets done in the first place, so that you can understand better why these particular sites, Palace in particular and Fort Des Moines No. 2 as examples, have received attention by archaeologists. I think traditionally you might think of archaeology as an academic discipline, something done by a professor at a college or university, and this does happen out there, but the vast majority of archaeological work that gets done in the United States at any rate is done for compliance reasons. That is, there are legal requirements that those who are disturbing the landscape through some kind of large-scale project take into consideration the effects of what their project is doing. And these laws, as Melody mentioned, date back to the 1960s, the National Historic Preservation Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. But there's a bigger reason than just legal compliance of why archaeology gets done. And it's the reason you're here. It's because it's fascinating. It's interesting to everybody, and I've heard little bits of conversation from folks as you came in and anticipating what you might hear or things that you found, your connections to the past, whether it be something as recent as just a generation or two, or for some of you who maybe collect artifacts that are much, much older, you have some sense of what life might have been like 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. So that basic human curiosity about who we are, where we came from, is what drives archaeology, and the reason that our society back in the 1960s passed these laws that require consideration of these things. Note I've been using the word consideration. We don't actually have laws either at the federal level or at the state level that protect archaeological sites. That protection is something that is watered down to consideration. So when you hear about a project like one of these going on, you have to remember that there are many, many other locations that never got considered, that were lost to the bulldozer or lost because they weren't required under the legal framework that we have to do any archaeology. So these are really special places that did receive attention. Let's see here. In case you're interested in further information than we can present tonight, this is our website. It's really the easiest way to find it is just search for the University of Iowa. And then on the Iowa homepage, there's an A to Z search, and you can look up state archaeologist under S, and you'll go right to our website, which looks like this. Currently, we have a link to a recent project report on the Fort Madison battlefield. Very different kind of context. It's the only War of 1812 battlefield we have in the state, so an important one. And then some other information and links on the left-hand side and across the top to get to all things archaeology in Iowa, so I invite you to look at that. By historical accident, the office is at the University of Iowa, but I assure you we have a statewide focus and really don't care one area or the other might be red and white or black and gold. So don't fret about that. There's a there's another resource that's accessible to the public as well that's called iSites Public. And we often get calls about, how do I find out if there's an archaeological site near me, or I know of an archaeological site, is it on the state records? And we put together iSites Public, which is available through a link on our webpage. Look under the geospatial program. And this is something that you can drill into, open up a mapping program. And what we do is we list how many archaeological sites per 1 mile section. As you probably know, Iowa is completely gridded off into 1 mile section blocks. And each of these has a number in it, and they're also color-coded. So the darker squares have more archaeological sites recorded than the lighter colored ones. And then in the white areas are areas that, so far at least, we have no archaeological sites on record. Now, I suspect that some of you and the people of Iowa probably know about sites in their general area that have never made it onto our records. So we would love to hear from you if you have information that would help flesh these records out. Because this database, iSites, is the first stop in terms of the compliance process. Those who are engaged in these kinds of projects, their consultants will come to us and look for previously recorded information about Iowa sites. So this is very useful. But if you live, for example, this is right near Mingo, Iowa, there's no sites on the record here. If in fact you know of those, then you can check this and say, oh, I know I have information that they don't, and we'd be happy to have you share that with us. Okay, so we mentioned a couple federal laws, National Historic Preservation Act, National Environmental Policy Act. The NEPA, as it's known, is the place that environmental impact statements come from. You may have heard of those. Large-scale projects that are considered federal undertakings, federal permits, federal money, are required to conduct analyses of all kinds of concerns: air, water pollution, noise, wetlands, endangered species, and cultural resources as well. And cultural resources include things like archaeological sites and historic buildings, among other things. It triggers the National Historic Preservation Act. And the National Historic Preservation Act, or Section 106, is a little bit of jargon that you might have heard of, contains the language that a reasonable and good faith consideration of cultural resources on federal projects is necessary. So analyses are done. Specialists like these folks here are hired by the applicants in the process to find out what's out there before the bulldozers roll through. And that's what leads to archaeological projects that you might read about in the paper. We also have a state law, and this state law does protect a particular kind of cultural resource, human remains. And the state law, the state Iowa burial law, actually protects all burials regardless of age. Okay? It's against the law, against state Iowa law, to disturb knowingly human remains of any age. My office has jurisdiction over ancient burials. And ancient burials specifically are those defined in the code as more than 150 years in age. So a subset of all human remains are protected by my office. And again, we have resources available for people to learn more about them. These booklets are available from the office or off of our website. We have one that's specifically for landowners if they want to learn more about their responsibilities under the law, another for developers. And Howard and some of his colleagues help us out tremendously with ancient burials that are Native American and form an Indian Advisory Council to my office. So we're very pleased to have Howard here with us tonight. Okay, so just real quickly, where are archaeological sites in Iowa? Well, as it turns out, there's lots of them that we do know about, and they are widely spread, but as you can see, it's not uniform. There's a pattern. Okay, can anybody see any patterns in here that they can name? Rivers, yeah. Rivers are a primary place to both find archaeological sites, and because it's where people lived in the past. They were attracted to those water resources just like we are today. So we're continuing a very ancient settlement pattern. There's another pattern in there. Can anybody see another pattern? Yeah, exactly. Highway 20 there jumps right out. Okay. And the reason that you have, and here's another roadway, and Highway 218's kind of buried in there, but the reason that those patterns are there is because that's where archaeologists have looked for archaeological sites. So when you look, you tend to find things. I'm sure you could take this same transect across this part of the state and you would find sites as well, even though there are none currently recorded, simply because no one has looked intensively there. So these are the 26,500 sites that we currently know about in Iowa. Many of those are destroyed. We estimate that more than half of those are no longer extant. They've been wiped out by one kind of development or another. Many of the others are what we say they're not significant. They don't have very much research value other than their locational data. But embedded within this, so I make this work, yeah, if we zoom into Polk County in particular, and we see here the locations of Fort Des Moines, number 2, in not far from here, downtown Des Moines, and then the Palace site out on the southeast part of town along the Des Moines River, are 2 examples of sites that meet the National Register of Historic Places standards for significance and importance in the past. And so that's what we're going to hear more about today as we go along. And I've probably way over talked my section, so I'm going to turn it over now to Bill Whitaker, who will tell you about the archaeology. Thank you, John.
Okay, well, downtown Des Moines has been, there's been a lot of holes dug in downtown Des Moines. The blue areas are the places that have been excavated in downtown Des Moines as of 2008, and we've actually done quite a bit more since then. Like we've done a lot of trenching up along 2nd Street and along Grand as well. Some of the main projects, because Des Moines is basically covered and paved with asphalt, we don't have, there really wasn't any archaeology done until 1982, because people really couldn't access any ground, and that was because of what is now the MLK Drive. And those were targeted specifically to find remains of Fort Des Moines number 2, the ancestor of the city of Des Moines, founded in 1843. So that explains all these excavations. There was a fair amount done for the Science Center prior to its construction because it was a federal undertaking. Again, this is Fort Des Moines number 2. Then we did a lot of sewer work that our office did. There was a lot of work done at the Vine Loft Apartments, also because it received federal funding, and a few odds and ends here and there around the city. So we have a fair amount of information about the archaeological landscape of downtown Des Moines, at least of the west side. There's a lot less information on the east side because there's a lot less development in the past 20 years on the east side of the river. And using this information, we have a pretty good idea of where prehistoric and historic Native Americans were on the landscape and what they were doing in downtown Des Moines. If we know from historic accounts that there was a mound group right in downtown Des Moines, extending from the courthouse outward, and in fact right about where we're at right now. There was 13 to 15 mounds that were historically known. All of them were destroyed by 1882, and to get to the ground surface where they used to be, you'd need a track hoe and a jackhammer, and you'd have to dig quite a ways down to get to the ground surface where they used to stand. Those are discussed in detail actually in one of the handouts that was up there. I only printed 20 of them. I didn't realize there'd be 80 or 90 people here. So the first 20 of you have that, have a more detailed explanation of it. But there are also settlement locations which were occupied prehistorically. There's the Birds Run site, which is north of Grand, the YMCA is here. There was an old river called Birds Run that used to go through town, and the site is called the Birds Run site, which has woodland and late prehistoric Oneota material coming from it. The same is also true of the Des Moines River component of 13 PK 61, which is where the Vine Loft Apartments were and extending down a little bit. And then where the Science Center was, there was a large Oneota site as well, and an archaic site and a smaller woodland site adjacent to it. So, not surprisingly, where the Raccoon River entered the Des Moines River and the nice terraces and bluffs leading up to that area was very attractive to Native Americans. And historically, we know that the Meskwaki, when they were forced over into this area, that Meskwaki and Sauk were actually utilizing the mound areas as historic ceremonial grounds up through where the old Methodist Church used to stand up through the courthouse ground area, and they used to have a pony racetrack going up and down to the bluffs as well. So we have some information from historic accounts of the historic Native American use of downtown Des Moines. These are just some pictures of what we've been doing. This is trenching in downtown Des Moines. We would go down up to 30 feet below surface, trying to find anything of the original surface. And along the riverway, and you can see the river behind here, this the city has been built up and built up and built up, and the banks have been built up so much that, you know, we often have to go down 30 feet to find the original surface, if there's any left. This is Bird's Run. This is the northernmost prehistoric site in the downtown area. And we did find some prehistoric Native American Oneota ceramics and some appropriate points. We also got some woodland occupation points. And unfortunately, this was heavily disturbed. What little bit of the original surface we found had already been disturbed. And you can see this. So this is Grand Avenue, Watson Powell. This is sort of a nice little park area now. And these red areas are the areas we excavated. The blue areas are foundations that we had to avoid. And so we're kind of just dodging around things. And when we did actually get into there, we found that there wasn't much going on. I mean, there wasn't much preservation left there. But we know people were there, and we know when they were there. And a radiocarbon date came out, it was the 1700s. This is the terminal prehistoric occupation for the Oneota. This is actually a block south of the Vine Loft Apartments, and this is where, while they were doing some water pipe trenching, we went and looked along the walls, and we actually found a little bit still of that prehistoric site kind of creeping out of the walls, and so we were able to extend and document the site. And again, the site had also been badly disturbed by historic action, by plowing, by development, but we know that they were there. There are no radiocarbon dates from this component, unfortunately. And the Science Center, only small portions of the Science Center were done, and they were done very quickly because there was a lot of political debate about whether or not this was a federal undertaking. And you know, we argued that because it got federal money, it's a federal undertaking, but it became a political issue, so only a very small portion of the Science Center was formally excavated. And they did find intact prehistoric features within the Science Center. So there was stuff here from a village. We don't know much about it because it was done very hastily and very quickly with a lot of help from volunteers. But you know, that's what happens. Fort Des Moines #2. Now we move on to the historic period. In 1843, the United States Army decided it was going to push all the Sauk and Meskwaki out of the state, and as sort of a midway point, they corralled them all to live along the Des Moines River southeast of what is now downtown Des Moines. And the military built a fort in which is now the location of downtown Des Moines. The fort, there is a map of the fort, but it has no scale. It has none of the landmarks on the historic map match up anything that exists now because the rivers have changed and Bird's Run have been buried. And it's only through subsequent excavation, a lot of historic research, that we're able to figure out where that map overlays with downtown Des Moines. And from that, we were able to determine which of the fort structures excavations have hit over the time. Raccoon Row cabins were excavated in 2000. An officer's quarter was found in 1985. In 2005, in that same trenching you saw 2 slides ago, we actually encountered an outbuilding associated with an officer's cabin. And I'm going to show you some slides of our excavations of the Captain James Allen's headquarters that we excavated in 2007 as part of Martin Luther King. Because Martin Luther King goes right through here now. Something that also helped us to figure out where Fort Des Moines was located was historic records and documentation. We looked at old photographs of buildings. Like this is a photograph of the first post office. And although it says it was built as a post office, we know that the first post office from other accounts was built in an old fort cabin. And this really looks like a dog trot cabin that's been covered over with siding. A lot like this fort period cabin, which was illustrated. We didn't know where this was, but by using adjacent buildings and looking at other maps and comparing those adjacent buildings, we were able to pin it down in the corner of Elm and First, and Elm is now MLK. And from that's another piece we were able to use to figure out where Fort Des Moines was located. As I said, we did a lot of excavation in Captain Allen's, the headquarters area of the fort as the approach from MLK to the bridge went. We didn't excavate this area because this area was actually filled in as the highway rises to go over the bridge. So if there is more fort, it is buried underneath the highway and is not being disturbed, so we did not touch it. But we found a couple of hearths associated with the headquarters building, a hidey hole secret box filled with goods that was actually in the floor of the officer's cabin. We found some sheet middens. All the pink stuff is fort period, by the way. We found some sheet middens that had fort period refuse in them, and we found a privy or latrine that was probably associated with Captain Allen's headquarters. And archaeologists love getting latrines because they're just full of stuff, well preserved. You get great flotation stuff, and they ate a lot of raspberries back then. I can tell you that. We tried doing radar, and radar works really well. And we got these excellent pictures of sewer pipes and excellent pictures of concrete reinforcement underneath the pavement. It didn't find anything from the fort because there's just too much rubble and stuff on top of it. But we did get some nice pictures of sewers. So this is the layout of the headquarters building. Here are the two hearth foundations, here and here. There's probably a puncheon floor between them, and in the center of the house was probably a central wall, and along one thing, there was actually a box that was cut through it with wood, with somewhat well-preserved wood walls to it, and it was filled with floor sweepings from the fort period. It had Indian trade beads in it, it had military buttons in it, it had other artifacts from that time period. And all this got covered over because this was the first recorded street. This was called Raccoon. Then it was later called Elm, and then it became, now it's MLK. And it was actually the first paved street in Des Moines. So we did get little bits of it. A lot of it had been disturbed. Like this is the base foundation. The top of it would have been built up with brick. Some of the artifacts we got here, some Indian trade beads for the Meskwaki and Sauk. Here is military buttons. This was actually from that hidey hole. Here are pipe stems. And we got a lot of lead type because this was the location of the earliest ancestor of the Des Moines Tribune, or the Des Moines Register, was in one of the abandoned cabins. And it was there from 1849 to 1851. And in 1851, there was a flood. They moved several blocks away. So that we know if we find type, and we found a lot of type, that it has to be from 1849 to 1851 when the newspaper was there. So that's a very clear marker for us. We know that anything below that is probably going to be the very earliest town period. So we're very happy to see that. Moving on from beyond the fort, something that you may have seen is we did excavate the library fountain and font of the old library. Here's the library building. This is the riverbank. Here's the river wall. This font was built in 1906. The fountain was built in 1906 and partially demolished and buried in 1955. They were a few years ago, they put a sewer right through the center there. But before they put in the sewer, we did a survey, and first to determine if there was anything left, and sure enough there was. So the city was quite cooperative, and we got permission and funds to excavate what was left of the fountain, and we got the back wall of the font was still there. And they had, while demolishing the fountain, they had actually carefully buried a lot of the font. And you could tell that they had carefully covered it over, and they were very concerned with it. And they'd placed in some architectural elements in the base, and so it was pretty interesting that somebody in 1955 thought this was going to be dug up again and be of interest. And so we found it. And the city was very cooperative, and we got, there aren't any detailed photographs of the fountain and font when they were in use, no close-ups of them, and there are no surviving plans of it. So we were actually able to make the only plans and sketches of the fountain and font as it existed on the basis of the archaeology. So that was one important thing we got. And we were able to salvage all the major architectural elements, and with a little bit of inveigling on my part, but the city was very cooperative, and Newman Construction was also very cooperative, and the World Food Prize all came together, and they've incorporated the elements of the original font into the new World Food Prize, into the remodeled World Food Prize building, which is the old library. So I was very happy to see that. I think it worked out very well. Some of the other interesting stuff we found are parts of the Walnut Street Bridge that stood between 1866 and 1891. We are 30 feet below ground in a deep, deep, deep trench, and we come across these huge timbers towards the bottom of the fill. And we keep digging and digging and digging until we find the ends of it, and then we finally figure out how it's all arranged. Then we scratch our head for a long time trying to think of what it is. And we go through old photographs, and we figured, hey, wait a minute, this is part of the truss work of the old Walnut Street Bridge. And we dug it up right here along the bank. And what it is in 1891, when they tore it all down, they probably just shoved a lot of it along the banks as riprap. And then it later got buried over by later fill and by later fill. So there's probably a lot more down there, but we left that where it was. We're not going to. I don't think any museum wants that. And now, what you've all been waiting for, the Palace site. This is not downtown Des Moines, but this is actually in the far southeast part of town at the sewage treatment facility. There was a federal undertaking to allow for a sewer connector from the downtown to the treatment plant. and where they're going to make a new facility to, it's called the Water Reclamation Authority Combined Sewer Solid Separation Facility, or the CSSSF. And it does probably what you think it does. And this area had we received federal funding, and therefore it got an archaeological survey. The archaeological survey did not find any prehistoric material in it, but there was some debate as to whether they had surveyed enough of it, or whether they had dug enough of it. There was also an historically recorded Sauk cemetery very nearby, so there was concerns that this might impact the historic cemetery. So it's decided to take another look at it, and so Mike Kolb, an excellent geomorphologist from Wisconsin, came back and did some really deep coring through there, and he said, look, there is potential way down there for prehistoric buried sites, and these are some of his core logs. And these are depths of features and artifacts that we'd found projected onto his cores. And you can see that, yeah, if you go down deep enough, you do find layers of historic occupation or prehistoric occupation within the site. So because there was a potential for this, we did start resurveying it. They brought in a new company to come out and resurvey what the other company had done. We did deeper augers, and we started finding stuff. And we were also doing construction monitoring when monitoring started. And right away, as soon as the machines start rolling, we start seeing stuff coming up. So there was a lot of stuff coming up right away. Like here's a nice patch of burnt earth from a hearth, and here's a little cluster of artifacts as we're going along. And we found a nice Middle Archaic Radit-style point during monitoring. So here's the work area as construction is beginning, as they're rolling the belly scrapers around. We find this stuff, everything grinds to halt until we decide what to do. We're given a certain amount of time to figure out what's going on with the site and to get rid of the problem. So the first question we have is, well, how extensive is the site? Because we just know we're getting little bits of stuff here, and there's potential over here, but we don't really know how far this extends out. So we devise a plan. We're going to do a series of trenching from the known area and radiate outward with mechanical trenching, and to see if we can figure out just how big the site is. As it turns out, this is pure folly because it was everywhere. It was under this whole area. The only thing the far south area, we found the old riverbank, so we had kind of a boundary on the south end, but everywhere else we just found stuff just everywhere. But we didn't know that at the time, of course. We had to do the trenches to figure that out. And the trenches were done, unfortunately, last year, which was not as nearly as nice a winter as this winter. And so here we are. This is a beautiful 10 degree below zero day. And so we're in trenches, and we're putting insulated blankets and plywood on top. We have kerosene propane heaters down there, and it was crazy. Fun, but crazy. So here's the trenches as they came out. We kept finding features and features and features and features, and it just didn't seem to stop, and we found clusters of area. And large parts of the site we couldn't even access because there was big back dirt piles on the north parts of the site, and we didn't have access to the northeast part of the site either. So in the part that we did have access to, it seemed to be stuff everywhere. So we narrowed it down to an area which we thought we could define a site boundaries based upon the old riverbank, and within that we decided to do certain areas as 10 by 10 meter shovel skimmed blocks where we do very careful controlled excavations. Marked in red. These didn't actually turn out to be where they were, but this is sort of a planning map. And then in other areas we were going to do 5 meter by 5 meter mechanical scraping, so we get a much broader coverage. And then as a third thing, we're going to monitor all construction as all the machines are moving as well. And the fourth thing was geomorphology sampling. We're going to do a lot more coring, try to figure out this landform, try to figure out some boundaries on this site. So during construction monitoring, we did our best to not interfere with the machines as they rolled. Here's Anton. He's pretty cool. Here he had found actually a late archaic hearth. And the machines keep rolling. We try to run out and have them work around us if we found stuff while monitoring. So at times we did have to shut them down because there was no way for them to get around us, and there was a lot of stuff in the way. But for the most part, we did our best to stay out of their way. First, the area had to be melted by using thermal coils laid over with blankets on top, and after that it got softened up. We the Rice Lake construction very cleverly devised these structures built out of storage containers and roof trusses and plywood and plastic. And so here's Home Sweet Home. And it provided a certain amount of warmth that we had propane in there. And here's what it looked like. And it didn't turn out to be 10 by 10. It was actually 12 by 8 or whatever. Yeah, whatever. We'll deal with it. And in addition to that, we also had to do kind of running out and do little small shelters in areas where we couldn't do the big shelters. So in our kind of warm enclosures, we started doing some piece plotting. And these pin flags represent artifacts as they're coming up when we're shovel skimming. You know, we'd find lots of burned earth and charcoal, occasional points and flaking debris, lots of bone. Everything was shot in with a total station EDM, so we have all digital, three-dimensional provenience for everything. Well, some of the downfalls of this thing is that we are within a floodplain, within a big hole, at the bottom of another hole. So if we got even a little bit of rain, it was just a big mess. And so we spent an inordinate amount of time cleaning out our units and pumping things out and trying to make it less messy. And as monitoring progressed and as we got access to more areas and were able to do even more trenching, we found even more site which urgently needed to be done right away because construction had to go through. And so this is some of the areas where this is Feature 24, which turned out to be a Middle Archaic house. And so we set up temporary shelters. We were doing multiple. We had at times 4 crews in different parts of the site. And we'd throw people on as needed to get as much done as needed so construction could keep going. So here's mechanical scraping blocks. Here is a 5x5 in progress where they strip down and we look for things to come up. The huge axe that's over there, that was actually found through mechanical scraping. And unfortunately, the one barrel of the woman and her child were found through mechanical scraping, and they were found actually farther away from the core of the site, and they were probably buried along a bank, along the old river bank. And once the burial was discovered, all work was stopped in that area, and consultation began, and then the OSA began its excavation after consultation, realizing that this could not be left in place, and then it was excavated after that by the OSA burials crew. The site as a whole, we started to learn more and more about the landform as we got more results from soil coring and as we got more stripping results. And so we were actually able to figure out what the ground would look like. Even though it looked pretty flat when we were out there, we know that 7,000 years ago in the Middle Archaic, it looked very different. The river was closer. There was a mid-Holocene terrace edge right up through here. The burial feature was right over here, right along this terrace edge, so it would have been a fairly prominent location. There's 4 Middle Archaic, or there's actually 6 possible houses from the Middle Archaic from 2 different phases, Phase 1 and Phase 2. Phase 1 is over 7,000 years. Phase 2 is a little less than 7,000 years. There was an area of terraces, probably an old meander area where there was a lot less material coming from it. And then there was an old early Holocene meander, which was probably a wetland at that time, where we found more clusters of material, which were people were probably coming to this area to do clamming and stuff. And then the landform rose up in the northwest part of the site, and we found even more features, but those date to a different time period. Those are actually later Archaic to later Middle Archaic to early late Archaic. If that makes sense. Yeah, they happen later. But we only got a small sample of them through trenches, and so we know a lot less about this than we do about the core of the site, where we got a lot better area. Some of the features we found, like this is feature 76, a dense concentration of animal bone. We get from several shell bins where people were just going to town on the clams of the area. We find a little bits of tools, little bits of burned earth, little bits of charcoal in these things, but a lot of people are just pulling up clams, and this was obviously a huge food resource. We'd find burned earth features where people were setting fires, probably for clam bake. Who knows? There are a lot of things going on. Here's another shell midden, close-ups of the shell midden. Here's a shell midden buried in the wall in the northwest side. You can actually see how the soil is a little bit darker here than above it. That's the old buried that's the old buried topsoil from in this case about 6,400 years ago, because this is actually the northwest part of the site. We did find a fair amount of birdstone. There was a lot less stone in this site than there are in later archaic sites, and they're using stone a lot more judiciously, but stone can tell you a lot about the activity areas and what people are doing and the different types of things that stones are using. How do you boil water if you don't have pots? You get a stone really, really hot and you put it in a skin bag full of water, or you make a waterproof pit and you drop these hot rocks in them. So heated stones are extremely important, not just for putting a ring around a campfire. And we're making some reconstructions of the site. These are some basic outlines of excavated areas in the gray, unexcavated areas in the white. Notice there's a lot of things that we don't know about that still have not been excavated, that are still in limbo. And we have a series of up to 6 houses. 2 of them in red here are from the earliest occupation, from a little over 7,000 years ago, and features associated with that are limited to this area. But then a little bit later, a little bit less than 7,000 years ago, component B, it's much larger, and we have twice as many houses, and the area is quite larger. Then we have the Northwest, which we don't know a lot about, and it's a later occupation where people are coming and doing some clamming. And then there's a little bits of green stuff, and those are subsequent occupations, like probably late archaic. Those are higher up. That's after this whole area had silted in and been more of a level occupation. Those are actually the things we found first because they were higher in elevation, and then we came down upon the middle archaic stuff. Those higher stuff are probably, I would guess, later archaic. We don't have radiocarbonates from them yet, but they're definitely after the main occupation. And here's a schematic representation of what the main occupation, the one less than 7,000 years would have looked like. With the burial area here, sort of that point is over here. Here's the kind of poorly understood terrace area. Here is an area which was probably a wetland where people were utilizing clams and getting clam resources from. And there's evidence that this was primarily a cold season occupation, which is why we made it a snow scene. And plus, snow is a lot easier to draw than grass. So radiocarbon dates support the idea that there's 2 middle archaic components. One with locus A, F, C, and B, these houses going through here. These circles represent radiocarbon dates, and this is absolute stratigraphy. This is depth, and this is 10 centimeters going this way, and this is 10 meters going this way, so it's a really compressed site. We've really squished it and pulled it down, so you can really exaggerate the stratigraphy from this. And so the site slopes down slightly this way, and these radiocarbonates are pretty consistent. And then the component 1, the older stuff, there's locus E and D and an outlying feature. And then these are all coded by the types of projectile points that we got from there: Raditz, Turin, Durst, Matanza, big sandy, side notch, and quarter notch points. And the most prominent one, in fact, the deepest one is a Raditz, and the highest one is a Raditz. And about half of in between are Raditz points as well. So it's dominated by so temporally there isn't a lot of variation, but spatially there is variation. Like all the Matanza came from locus C, for example. Here's the radiocarbon plotted out. Here's component 1, component 2, and you can see here's the 7,000 year cutoff line. So a little over 7,000, a little bit younger than 7,000 years. There's one really screwy date, and that's actually feature F. We got 2 radiocarbon dates, and the one on top was actually older than the one on the bottom. But that's why it's called 2 sigma deviance, because there's always going to be a range of stuff. And you have factors of old wood, so I'm not too horribly worried about that. But the other ones are pretty consistent within this time period. And then this is the Great Northwest, where we have less information, but it is a later occupation. Because we have all this 3-dimensional points, we're able to piece plot all the material. Like here's the suspected houses. Like here is locus D, here's locus A, locus E, the edge of it, and we can show you where all the artifacts were piece plotted from them within those prescribed areas. We can piece plot individual projectile points. This is from locus B, and this shows, we can't really see it very well, but it's coded out by projectile point, so we can show you spatially where all the points are coming from. We can also do that with animal remains. Like I took a deer here, and I coded all of its skeletal elements, and then I plot them visually by element and showing where they are within the house. And What I can tell you about deer is they were smashed to bits, and they were taking every bit of marrow out of that deer they could, and you find every skeletal element everywhere within the house. So there isn't any clear patterning to the butchering. I think they really were processing the heck out of it. And using, like, for example, house B, locus B, you can sort of get a feel for the shape of it, because this is plotting the deepest artifact within each square meter, and it can show you how the house feature kind of bowls downward. This is topographically, this is deeper, and this is deeper, and then it rises up over here and rises up over here. So it can give you a sense for that. And then we have a three-dimensional spinning representation of the entire site, showing different soil types and all the clusters of artifacts within the site. So you can do a lot of cool things with three-dimensional stuff. We did a lot of flotation analysis from it. Macrobotanical, we're seeing a lot of elm, oak, ash, Kentucky coffee tree. These are the types of woods that they're burning. Nuts, legumes, fruits, wild onions, camas bulbs, bulrush and sedges, grasses, wildflowers. Faunal remains, just tons of deer, as well as the shell. But there's just tons of deer. There is some dogs and turkey, raccoon, gopher, turtle, shellfish, birds, and some fish remains. But surprisingly, not as much fish as I would think there would be. And there's a good preservation, so there's just something funny going on with the fish. They're not eating as much as they should be. I'm a bone specialist, so I spend more time on the animal stuff. But there's a lot of worked antler. I think a lot of it is they're cutting off the antler with stone tools, and then using the other end that's been cut off as pressure flaking tools. But the antler does tell us that this is probably a cold season occupation, as well as this particular antler, because it has still a bit of the frontal bone, which meant it was still on the head of the buck, and the diameter of it meant it was probably towards after well into the cold season. And there's other evidence this is a cold season occupation. Pallas dogs. Turn that down. Historic Indians used dogs for traction, food, hunting, guarding, and sacrifice. They were not companion animals. There isn't a lot of historic accounts of Native Americans using dogs as pets in the way that Westerners use pets in the 20th century. The dogs at the Pallas site, there's different sizes of dogs were found at the Pallas site. Most were probably domestic. Others fall within the size range of coyotes, which means we can't really tell if they've been domesticated or if they're wild coyotes. We find puppies, we find adults, we find older dogs. The context indicates that they were eaten. They are smashed to bits, and they are mixed up with all the other animal remains. The absence of gnaw marks on the other animals really indicates that they were kept outside of these structures, because if you let your dogs into a house full of bone shards, they're going to have gnaw marks all over them, and there are very few gnaw marks on these other bones on there. So that's, again, evidence that these are not pets that are kept inside. And there's also no evidence of formal dog burials. These are mixed in with all the other animal remains. And now I'm going to actually hand it over to Melody again, and she's going to talk a little about the stone technologies and the bigger picture as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Well, I'm going to go through pretty quickly here, talk to you a little bit about the stone tool technologies from the Pallas site. You don't want to get me talking about stone tools because I won't shut up, and it's time for you guys to talk soon. That stone tools are my thing, but we on archaic sites, you find a lot of stone tool technology. These people weren't making pottery at this time, so we don't have pottery. We certainly have animal remains, the food remains, but we have lots of stone tool and stone tool making remains that are well preserved because it's rock. So most of what the artifact baggage that you find on these archaic sites are in fact stone tools and the debris from making stone tools. And actually on prehistoric sites of this time period and just about any time period, believe it or not, about 99% by count of all your artifacts are the chipstone flakes, flaking chips from making stone tools. When you make stone tools, you're removing flakes from a core of stone. It's a reductive process, unlike making pots. When you add clay, when you make stone tools, you take rocks away, and it creates lots of small flaking debris. So that can tell us a lot about production, how stone tools were made.
that can tell us about, we find very tiny pieces of stone debris from our flotation samples that can tell us about places, those usually are left where the stoneworking happened. So the little tiny pieces of rock are really important to us. They tell us about where people were doing stone tool making and using as well. We find a variety of stone tools made out of chert or flint. We have drills, very common for our Middle Archaic sites. Scrapers, probably used for scraping hides. Projectile points, of course, tell us about hunting technologies and also about time. We use them to help us date sites relatively. We also have tools that are what we call situational tools. They're actually people going through probably piles of flint debris, picking out pieces that will do some job for them. And so there's very little modification or shaping. But we can tell by the use wear, the wear, we can study by using a microscope at high magnifications. We can actually study the use wear patterns on stone tools and learn not only information about how these tools were made, but also how they were used and people's attitudes, of course, about stone. They also tell us about how people were moving along the landscape in terms of where they were going to get their stone to make their tools with. So far, it looks like the people at the Palace site were able to gather their stone very locally, right there from the gravel bars in the river. They didn't have to go very far. We're not finding a lot of chert that was brought in from faraway places, although we do have some chert. For example, this white chert that this drill is made out of probably originated perhaps down in close to Missouri, down further south of us here, of Des Moines. We also have lots of groundstone tools and from the site, axes, adzes, tools probably for felling trees, maybe making canoes, building their structures, other kinds of uses. We find stones that were used as grinding platforms or pallets. This particular stone, you can see it has a slight red shade to it. It was used for processing ochre or hematite, probably as a pigment. For some particular use, either ritually or as a preservative, perhaps. So stone tools can tell us a lot about the things people were doing at the sites, and we can look at how they were used and then how they were making tools, the technologies that they had to, that they were aware of to make their tools. So as Bill indicated, just to wrap up here, because this was a federal undertaking, archaeology was done under the auspices of the Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. What that means is that we do our excavations within the footprint of the construction. So all the gray areas are where we conducted our investigations. Those are the areas that will be impacted by the sewer facility. The houses that you were looking at previously are in this area right across here. So you can see the yellowish areas are places that are not planned currently for construction, but clearly the site extends into those areas. So there are ongoing concerns about the future preservation of those parts of the site as well. Okay, Shirley Shermer, director of the OSA Burials Program. Hannah Skates, archaeology technician with the Palace site. Curtis Kettler, archaeology technician, also working on the Palace site. Angela Collins, project archaeologist, working on many projects for us at the OSA as well as the Palace site. Bill Whitaker, of course, a project archaeologist. John Dorshik, state archaeologist. Robin Lilly, a skeletal biologist with the Burials Program, works with Shirley. Howard Crow Eagle, a member of the Iowa Indian Advisory Council. And Joe Arts down at the end, he's a director of the geospatial program at the OSA and a geoarchaeologist by training.
How did you come up with the name Palace site?
Well, how did we come up with the name Palace site? Well, at first it was a bit facetious because, we're in this mud-filled area and machines are rolling and trying to, they live in quite a palace. But then we realized, oh my gosh, this really is a palace. This is just this huge site with these well-preserved houses. It was, suddenly, instead of being tongue-in-cheek, it was very appropriate and applicable. So the name stuck.
And I'd add to that, as someone who has studied Middle Archaic sites in other parts of the Midwest, it's important to impress that not just for Iowa, but for regionally, the deposits preserved at the Palace site are spectacular in terms of the knowledge we have of what was going on 7,000 years ago. So it truly is a special place. There is one other location in Iowa that also dates to this period, and actually a little bit earlier as well, and it's near the town of Cherokee. It was also discovered as part of a sewer project, a sewer improvement project. Unfortunately, the name stuck as the Cherokee sewer site, and we didn't want to repeat the Des Moines sewer site. We wanted something with a little bit more cachet to it, so Palace stuck happily.
Could you tell us more about the findings of the mother and child as far as what they could die from, or anything that we've learned about their skeletal remains?
The question was long, but it was basically asking what kind of information we have about the individuals in the burial. I'd like to preface my answer with the information that this burial was only removed because we had no option. It would have been destroyed by the construction. Before removing the burial, the area around it for 10 meters in all directions was excavated to the same depth or deeper than where the burial was, to make sure that we were looking at only an isolated burial and not a cemetery or multiple burials. And this was the request of our Indian Advisory Council, and it was during that monitoring that I found that axe, and I just had to get that in there. So, but in terms of what we know about the burial, preservation was not real good. It was fair. The individual is female, probably young to middle-aged, and there were also the remains, and she was laying on her side with her legs flexed, pretty typical burial position for this time period. There were some, the remains and all the soil around were covered with red ochre, which is obviously part of some ceremony, well, not obviously, but I would assume is part of a ceremony. It is also typical of burials from the archaic. The infant remains were very limited and with just teeth and a bit of the cranium, which is also pretty typical, and was probably about 6 months old. And that's about all we know.
As Robin had mentioned, prior to the decision to excavate the burial, there was ongoing consultation with the Indian Advisory Council, and Jonathan Buffalo and Don Wanatee, both from the Squawkey settlement, the Saucon Fox of the Mississippi and Iowa, were involved in this project from the start in consultation because of the historic presence of village and cemetery nearby. So anyway, the consultation, the decision that was mutually reached that the remains would be disinterred, examined, and then reburied. Iowa's current burial law that was passed in 1976 provided for the establishment of a state cemetery specifically for the reburial of ancient remains. And over the years working with the Indian Advisory Council, their preference was that there be 4 cemeteries established, one in the north, south, east, and west, representing the 4 cardinal directions. And so the analysis has been finished. Not only do we have to comply with Iowa law, but we also have to comply with federal law, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA. And since these remains being 7,000 years old, there's no way we can link them in terms of affiliation with a modern-day tribe. And so under NAGPRA, they're considered culturally unidentifiable. And we have a process, or basically a memorandum of agreement with 21 tribes, federally recognized tribes with a historic interest in Iowa, that we will, as part of our compliance with NAGPRA and Iowa law, these remains will be reburied in one of these state cemeteries.
I guess I just remember when we were at the site, what Jonathan was talking about, when he was talking to that relative who we visited that day, and he said that he did a prayer, and he told that relative that the people that were there were good people and that they were going to see that he was placed back into Mother Earth. These times when we go into these sites, it's a really hard time for me to come across those relatives that are found, but it's a really good feeling when they're put back into Mother Earth. I know those folks never had any idea that 7,000 years from the time they were placed in the Mother Earth that they would be uncovered and their resting place would be disturbed. So we know that there's a lot of there's a lot of things that have to be done respectfully to those relatives, and so it's just an honor that I'm part of that council that oversees those projects, and I'm able to perform those types of ceremonies. And in this case, it was Jonathan that did it, and I think respectfully so. I know Dan Higginbottom from the State Historical Society called me and asked me if I was going to come and do a ceremony there, and I said no, I was going to wait until the council got together. So those things are dealt with per case as they come up. We had another incident where there was a burial that was disturbed, and I oversaw that project and was able to make sure that things were done respectfully. And I just keep remembering that the last day that project was done, an eagle came out of the south and circled that site and then flew off into the east. And so to me, that was a good sign that things were done respectfully, and those relatives were appreciative of what was happening there. So I feel good that that relative knows that he was in good hands.
So I'm going to leave you now with this last slide. Let you maybe get a sense of the past 7,000 years ago here in Des Moines.
Funding for this program was provided by Friends, the Iowa Public Television Foundation. Generations of families and friends who feel passionate about the programs they watch on Iowa Public Television.